Since I was a child, instead of measuring time in years, I measure it in music. I have lived jumping from one musical moment to another because that's what life is for me. Life is music. But the moment I received the call confirming that Kurt Cobain, my friend, the referent of a generation, the soul of Nirvana, had died, music stopped, and with it, my life.
Welcome to Trembol Podcast, the place for music stories that thrill.
Hi, my name is Dave Eric GROHL. I was born January 14th, 1969 in Ohio, USA, although my family soon moved to Virginia, perhaps because that was my mother's name, Virginia. She was a teacher. Among other jobs, she worked nights and weekends to support my sister and me. My father, James Harper GROHL, was a political journalist. They divorced when I was 7, so I grew up with my mother. I've always considered myself a different kid. Ever since I got corrective shoes at 7 that prevented me from wearing the cool t-shirts my classmates wore, I've been the odd one out.
Run, Forrest, run!
Don't think I was also a very active child, as evidenced by my many scars, from when I was run over without consequences at the age of 4, to when I opened my head with a baseball bat at the age of 9. After school, the place I visited the most was the doctor.
The doctor is in.
But don't worry, I always survived. I became interested in music in my teens. I still remember how my mother and I would go every Sunday to sit at a little table in a jazz club in Washington called 930 and listen to the different bands that would play for hours. I loved it. Although my thing has always been the drums, my first contact with an instrument was with the guitar. I took some lessons at age 12, although I soon got tired of it and decided to teach myself. At that age, I was always listening to the fastest, loudest, and most obscure stuff I could find, while my sister Lisa, 3 years older than me, was more into new wave. We almost always ended up playing David Bowie and Susie and the Banshees. The summer of '82 would change me forever. I was 13, my sister and I went to Illinois to my cousin Tracy's house, who took us to several punk band concerts. I still remember the first one, by a band called Naked Raygun. It broke my mind. The organized chaos of their music would become my biggest musical influence, something that would be reflected in the future in Smells Like Teen Spirit. Another big influence was Sandy, my first love. I was with her for almost 1 full week, and then she left me breaking my heart. That day I promised myself that one day Sandy would come to see me as a rock star, and she would regret it. The former happened, the latter didn't. I was always a bad student, in that in my first high school I was elected class vice president, which allowed me to use the school intercom. As you can imagine, I would put on good punk bands to start the morning off right. I remember that for a music project we were asked to do a song. I formed a duo with a friend. We called ourselves H.G. Hancock, and I composed my first song, Bitch. Do you know who it was dedicated to? To my dog, because he deserved it. I took a liking to it and went on to compose another song dedicated to my school and even one for Ronald Reagan.
And I know in my heart that man is good.
I have to confess that I smoked a lot of cannabis, so my mother moved me to another high school to get me away from that environment. In the next one, I lasted 2 years and changed again. While I was in high school, I played in several bands as a guitarist. One of the first was called Freak Baby. It was during that period that I self-taught myself to play drums. I would listen to and imitate the drummers in punk rock bands like Rush, which I loved. In fact, in my band, we changed the name to Mission Impossible, and I became the drummer. Even though punk was my thing, as I was telling you, my mother and I, who were very good friends, still went on Sundays to listen to jazz. I still remember one year we celebrated his birthday there, and my mother insisted that I go on stage to play drums as a present. I was terrified because the people playing there were geniuses to me, and I was a kid playing at home with 2 cushions, but I agreed. I was dripping with sweat when I sat down on the stool. I don't even know how I played a short song, just worried about keeping time and not making a mess. I got out of the way, but I understood that I needed to take lessons to gain confidence. I could think of no one better than Lenny Robinson, the best drummer in the jazz club. I asked him and he agreed. What I didn't know was that he would charge me $30 per hour, so I paid him for the first hour and I didn't give any more lessons. I kept on playing and trying to find what John Bonham, the drummer of Led Zeppelin, had. You may ask what it is. Technique, skill, speed? No, none of that. What I had was a language of my own. Every note I played meant something that I felt very strong inside me. Mission Impossible, my band was renamed Fast, and so we split up very quickly. With a couple of other friends in 1985, I put together a new hardcore punk band we called Dane Bramage. We produced what would be my first full-length album, I Scream Not Coming Down. At 17 years old, I got the opportunity of a lifetime. I had been loving a band called Scream for years, veterans of the underground punk scene with a great reputation, and I had learned to play drums just by listening to them. I knew each and every one of their songs inside out. In fact, I dreamed of playing with them. One day, passing by the record store where I left my paycheck every week, I saw a sign that said, "Scream is looking for drummers." I couldn't believe it. How a band that had been playing international gigs for years was advertising in a music store in Virginia. But that's just the way it was. Of course I signed up for the audition, although I will tell you a secret. I had to lie to them and say I was 21 years old, so there would be no problems for being a minor. Not without fear, but with a lot of determination, I played in the audition. When I finished, they came up to me and said, "You can join Scream." Would you believe it? My dream of becoming a rock and roll musician could become a reality. But of course, I had to drop out of high school. My mother being a teacher, disappoint my father who wanted me to go into politics and leave my friends in the band behind. And on top of all those things, I was terrified, so I said no to them. A few months went by and Scream came to play in a small bar in my town, so of course I went to see them. The concert was crazy, so much so that when it was over, I said to myself, I have to be a part of this. I gathered my strength and told my mother, who replied,
"I hope you are really good."
And to my father, who yelled at me, "Stay away from drugs." I was now free to tour the world with a rock and roll band. We started with 23 gigs in the United States. Of course, we didn't have a dime, so we went in a Dodge minivan where the band members and instruments fit together like a puzzle. I, who had never been further than Chicago, was amazed. Not only that, but on the tour I met most of my teenage punk rock idols. It was a dream come true. Before every show, we smoked weed, had a few beers, and went out to destroy the stage. But equally, that trip taught me more about life than school had done in my first 18 years. Until 1990, I recorded 2 albums of good hardcore punk with Scream. We toured Europe and continued to have a lot of fun until the bass player, Skeeter, decided to quit, leading to the dissolution of the band. I moved to Los Angeles with some of the members of the now ex-band and started working in a coffee shop. In the last few years, I had lived my dream. I had even played with Iggy Pop. Can you believe it?
Oh my God!
But I was without a band and without a clear future until one day I heard 5 magic words.
Have you heard of Nirvana?
Yeah!
Of course, I had heard of them. Their only album so far, Bleach, was one of my favorites. Because among all the noise of punk rock, they had written an album of songs with capital letters. And what to say about Kurt Cobain's voice? Wow! The thing is that Nirvana was changing drummers. So I got their number and called them. At first, they told me that they had already found a replacement, but that they had seen me play with Scream, and they liked me. I had a chance to talk to Kurt, and our musical tastes matched like a glove, so they offered me to join the band and move to Washington. Again, I was in the situation of leaving my family. This time, they were not my father and mother, but my bandmates. After those 2 years touring the world, we were like brothers. I did not know what to do, and as always happens when I am in that situation, I called my mother. Do you know what she told me? That at certain times in life, you have to put your interests before the interests of others. So I said goodbye to my mates and joined Nirvana in 1990. Kurt and I lived in a dump in Washington. He slept in the only room there was, and I slept in my sleeping bag next to his turtle. He was a big fan of turtles. We didn't even have enough to eat, so if I was already skinny, I became a toothpick. When our first paycheck came, I couldn't believe it. $400. All my life, all I had done was survive, so that was a real bundle. I felt like I was already a millionaire rock star, and as such, I spent almost all of it on a console. There were more than a few times I thought about moving back to Virginia with my mother, but there was always one thing that tied me down: the music. As dysfunctional as Nirvana was, when we started playing, magic would happen. Kurt was a born creator. Almost every week he would come up with a new idea for a song. He would come up with a riff in the rehearsal room, and me and Crest, the bass player, would follow him. Simple verses that exploded into choruses. In that way, we slowly put together Nirvana's second and most iconic album, Nevermind. It was released in 1991, including the song that would change our lives and many young people's forever, Smells Like Teen Spirit. When I was 22 years old, I started the tour to present the album. We would tour 30 cities in just 40 days, playing clubs that could hold about 600 people. Although it was hard, we slept in hotels and my pay was double that of my time in Scream, from $7 to $14, so I felt rich. But it was noticeable that something was changing. Every day, more and more people attended. We were going from an exclusively punk world to become mainstream, that is to say, a commercial success. We liked it, but it also went against everything alternative that we had always defended. But don't think that the change made the concerts calmer. In fact, the opposite. They were becoming more and more chaotic, even dangerous at times.
Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl arrived in Australia as a really successful rock band.
In 1992, we had already become a music revolution, one that a whole generation followed with veneration. We, Pearl Jam, and Red Hot Chili Peppers represented the cultural change that millions of young people were looking for. Of course, that was reflected in sales, over 300,000 copies every week. We were even invited to play on television, on Saturday Night Live, in front of millions of people. The tension was palpable in the atmosphere, even more so when in the middle of the performance, one of my drumsticks broke. But I hid it until I was able to change it, and in the end, everything went well. Although friends, Nirvana were three people who lived our independent lives and got together only to rehearse or go on tour. One of the times we got together before a tour that would take us through Japan and Australia, I noticed Kurt was very fragile. I found out he was using heroin, and although he told us it was nothing, it would eventually turn out that it was. Anyway, we went on tour and it turned out better than I thought it would. When we came back, as we always did, we each went back to our own lives. I spent some time in Hawaii while Kurt married his girlfriend Courtney Love and had his daughter Frances Bean. I soon heard from him he wanted to change the financial split in the band. So far it had been 50-50. Both bassist Chris Novoselic and myself, Dave GROHL, were aware that Kurt wrote most of the songs, and we agreed until he also asked for it to apply retroactively, i.e. to the income from our Nevermind album. There was a lot of bad feeling and we were about to split up, but after a week of arguing, we reached an agreement and gave him 75% of the compositions, including the old ones. The following year, 1993, we released Nirvana's third album, In Utero. We changed producers, and although Kurt was not very happy, the recording sounded less artificial than the previous album. The success was also less, but still MTV invited us to do an unplugged, a live acoustic concert. It was something memorable, an album that today is music history because it revealed the depth of Kurt's compositions, among them the great Come As You Are. also composed, but usually the songs were not Nirvana grunge style. So I made up a pseudonym, Late, and recorded a demo, which I called Pocket Watch. Only 100 copies were released on cassette, and I gave them away to friends. Back to Nirvana, or rather, what would unfortunately be the end of Nirvana. In 1994, we embarked on a new tour of Europe. Although the tour started well, the concerts gradually got worse. Kurt was bored, he was distracted during the concerts, he was diagnosed with severe laryngitis, and we canceled the tour. I went back to America, and a few days later, I received a call saying that Kurt Cobain had died. I burst into tears. My friend, my partner, the great musician was gone. Soon after, the phone rang again, saying that he might be alive. You can't imagine my relief. Kurt was in Rome, and his wife, Courtney Love, had found him unconscious from a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol, but they were able to revive him at the hospital. His family convinced him to enter rehab to fight his heroin addiction. Kurt agreed, but within a week, he ran away, flew home to Seattle, and shot himself. This time, there was no second call to say he would recover. Kurt was gone from my life and everyone's life. I was 25 years old and had my whole life ahead of me, but for the first time, the music made me ache. Every note reminded me of Kurt and Nirvana. Time went by, and although the wound was still alive, I was offered to join Pearl Jam as a drummer, and even the incredible Tom Petty, with whom I got to play once on TV. It was a memorable experience and an honor, but I did not imagine myself playing behind a band again. That stage of my life had passed. I did not want to be remembered only as the guy who played drums in a legendary band, so I dedicated myself for a while to compose, without a clear objective. Life went on, and I decided to move on too. Personally, I married Jennifer Lee Youngblood, a photographer from Michigan, whom I would eventually divorce 3 years later in 1997. Musically, my songwriting was progressing, and there came a point where I began to feel comfortable and somewhat proud of what I had created. So I decided to rent a studio for a week and record the songs. I played all the instruments and sang all the songs. It was 1995 and I had an album ready, but I was missing a name, something to hide the fact that I was the ex-drummer of Nirvana. At that time, I was reading about UFOs, something I've always been passionate about. And in one of the books, they said that in the Second World War, the unidentified flying objects were called Foo Fighters. I loved it. It sounded very mysterious. It was time to go on tour. It would have been a bit complicated to do it on my own, so I recruited some musicians and we formed a band. First, I called Pat Smear, who had joined as a guitarist in the final stage of Nirvana, then my friend and great bass player Nate Mendel, and on drums, William Goldsmith. I left the drums behind and stepped up to the front as lead singer and guitarist. It was 1997, and after a little hiatus to do a soundtrack for a movie called Touch, I had a new collection of songs ready for what was to be the second Foo Fighters album. I got the band together and we started recording, but when we finished, I wasn't convinced by the sound of the drums, so I re-recorded them myself. Of course, the drummer, William Goldsmith, didn't like it and left the band. But the problems didn't end there. I argued with our bass player, Nate Mendel, and he told me that he was going to leave the band too. I thought that was going to be the end of Foo Fighters, but luckily Nate and I talked. We cried together for a while, and he stayed with us. All we had to do was hire a drummer. Luckily, life put Taylor Hawkins, who played drums with Alanis Morissette, in my path. I convinced him to join us, and Taylor would not only become the new drummer for Foo Fighters, he would become my soul brother.
Thank you for being a friend.
That's how we finished what would be the most acclaimed album of our entire career, The Color and the Shape. Tracks like Monkey Wrench, My Hero, were huge, but the song that would define the future of the band and is our biggest hit was Everlong. I wrote it in the winter of '96, hurt because my relationship with my wife Jennifer was ending, and because the group was at a low point, as I was telling you. The result was what many consider to be the most romantic song in the world.
I love you.
For the third album, we moved to my homeland, Virginia, where I built a small studio where we felt at home. The band was joined by the great guitarist Chris Shiflett, and thus came the 1999 album, There Is Nothing Left to Lose. It had a much more natural, more melodic sound than its predecessors, and became #1 on the Billboard chart. Several of the songs were used as part of the soundtrack of movies and TV series, among them the magnificent Learn to Fly. In 2002, we released our fourth album, One by One. The album generated a lot of controversy because of the controversial video of the song Low, where we made a big mess in a motel with actor Jack Black. But that wasn't the worst of it. Our song, My Hero, started to be used in George Bush's election campaign. I had never been involved in politics, but I couldn't accept that, so I decided to support his rival John Kerry. In the end, Bush won, and I played in the White House for him. What a life. In 2003, I remarried to what is now my wife and the mother of my 3 daughters, Jordan Bloom. At that time, she was a model, and I met her by chance one day when I was accompanying Taylor Hawkins, our drummer, on a date he had, a bit of a gig. When I saw her, I freaked out. I drank half a bar to get the courage to talk to her. I didn't get it, so I wrote on a piece of paper, "You will be my future ex-wife." Apparently it worked. With her, I have had 3 amazing girls. Don't think it was easy. Reconciling family life with a life dedicated to rock and roll was and still is a big challenge. Once I had to go back and forth from Australia in 2 days to attend a father-daughter school dance, including turbulence and vomiting, but I'll spare you the details. Just to see Violet and Harper's excited faces was worth it. For me, having children has meant truly discovering what love is. I have already told you that I used to spend 9 months a year away from home from concert to concert. Now I try to never spend more than 2 weeks, and sometimes, if it coincides with vacations, I take the family on tour. The truth is that it's risky because everything has happened to me on tour. From the time I was arrested in Australia for driving a quad without a license, to the time I stopped a concert because a guy started a fight in the middle of the audience, I didn't continue until he left the venue. I have lived 1,000 complicated situations, but nothing more difficult than entertaining little girls. Before going to each city, I have to organize what I'm going to do with them before the concert. I confess that toy stores are my salvation. I always had a dream to play with my favorite heavy metal singers, Lemmy Kilmister, Max Cavalera, or King Diamond. So in 2004, I started a side project with Foo Fighters called Probot. As in other occasions, I wrote all the songs and convinced them to join. It was a lot of fun, and it was quite successful. So far, I haven't done it again, but who knows? 2005 was the year of the release of my first Foo Fighters double album, In Your Honor. On one side, it contained the songs with the band's traditional rock sound, and on the other, acoustic and quieter versions of the same songs. The biggest hit was Best of You. See if that rings a bell.
Someone taking your face, it's real, the pain you feel, you trust, you love, you trust, getting the best, the best, the best, best of you. Wow.
2 years later, we released the 6th Foo Fighters album, Echoes, Silence, Patience, and Grace. The album also includes the song Let It Die, inspired by the relationship between Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love. The album would triumph at the 50th Grammy Awards, winning 2 awards for Best Hard Rock Performance and Best Rock Album. Not only that, but the song The Pretender would become a fan favorite. In my life, I have played many great concerts, but the 2 back-to-back concerts we played in 2008 at Wembley Stadium in the UK were very special. The stadium was packed to capacity, and we were joined by guests such as John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. To make it even better, at one part of the concert, drummer Taylor Hawkins and I, Dave GROHL, switched places. I went back to my beloved drummer, and Taylor sang great. We finally released the concert on a DVD entitled Foo Fighters Live at Wembley Stadium. The year 2009 came, and without realizing it, many things came together, and that would have serious consequences, I tell you. I had the opportunity to put together a band with two rock legends, Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age and John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. I couldn't say no, so we got together in a studio and created Them Crooked Vultures. It worked out better than we expected, and we went on tour. At the same time, Foo Fighters was turning 15, so we released our first compilation album, Foo Fighters' Greatest Hits. But not only that, I was invited to the White House to play for President Obama, with all the ensuing nerves. To complete the perfect storm, I didn't even sleep 3 hours a day, because my two little daughters wouldn't let my wife and me. To cope with everything, I drank tons of coffee. It was too much together, and it all led to severe chest pains. I was in my 40s, and I was convinced I was going to have a heart attack. I went to the doctor, and luckily, he only prescribed me to give up coffee and cut back on the battery, 3 days a week max. Since then, I have followed the instructions, I have a family to take care of, and lots of rock fans to yell at. With renewed energy, in 2011 we released Wasting Light, which we accompanied with a documentary where we revealed one of our secrets. Do you want to know what it is? Well, it turns out that every time we finish a song completely, we go to my car, which has a good stereo, and to another car, which has a very bad radio, to see if it plays well in both. If it doesn't, we redo the song. For our 8th album, Sonic Highways, we wanted to do something different, so we released the album with 10 different covers that referenced each of the cities where it was recorded. Actually, there were 9, but on the 10th one, we put all the images together. It was in 2015 that Foo Fighters found that defining moment that defines you as an artist. We were playing a gig in Sweden. We had gone from medium-sized venues to stadiums, and I felt great entertaining a sweaty mass of exultant fans smelling of beer. I have always considered the connection with the audience as a sublime thing, something that can only be described with 2 words: fucking awesome.
90% of people love to rock. The other 10% are deaf.
The thing is that I was excitedly playing a guitar solo, and I tripped over the cable of an amplifier. I fell like a sack, the huge height that separates the stage from the floor. I felt that I had broken my leg and my ankle was out of place. What was I going to do? The 50,000 spectators were screaming like crazy, and I couldn't leave them like that. I asked my wife to lend me her leather jacket, and I bit it with all my might while a medic put my ankle back in place. I asked another to run to the nearest hospital for a cast and kept singing. I know it was really crazy, but the love I received from the audience that night made it all worth it. I don't know if I have already told you, but I don't know music. I mean, I don't know how to read sheet music. I do everything by ear. Still, I didn't do too bad, did I? Well, that's what I thought until 2016, when one of those moments happened that every person keeps in their heart forever. My middle daughter, Harper, who had just turned 7, came up to me and said, "Daddy, I want to learn how to play the drums." A smirk came across my face, but I instantly panicked. I had never had lessons, except for that 1 hour for $30 I told you about with the jazz drummer. How was I going to teach her? The thing is that when she started playing, the fear vanished, because I understood that, like me, she would find her way. It was in her DNA. Just like my eldest daughter, Violet, who at that time was already singing in small venues with her high school band. Of course, my heart goes out to her every time I hear her sing everything from Aretha Franklin to Guns N' Roses. What pride! The band's 9th album, Concrete and Gold, arrived in 2017 with a lot of surprises. I convinced Paul McCartney, who, believe it or not, gave my daughter her first piano lesson, to play drums on Sunday Rain, and Justin Timberlake to play backing vocals on Make It Right. This album would also mark the official entrance of Rami Jaffee as a member of the group on keyboards. In 2019, we decided to release a series of albums with B-sides of From In Your Honor to Wasting Light. We also started working on a new album, but the virus came at setting the plans. It occurred to us that it would be really cool to use one of our songs to support the healthcare workers who were fighting COVID-19 on the front line. So we surrounded ourselves with a bunch of artists and sang one of our best songs, Times Like These.
To love again. It sounds like these times. Oh yeah!
Our 10th album, Medicine at Midnight, was released in 2021, including songs I loved like Shame Shame, No Son of Mine, or Waiting on a War. But don't think that's all. I've always loved doing covers. In 2021, we took that passion one step further and recorded a full album with Bee Gees songs. We call it DGs, Hail Satin. You know, after 30 years of playing gigs all over the world, I allow myself a little treat when I finish a special one. Want to know what it is? A nice box of Kentucky Fried Chicken with champagne. It may sound strange, but it's a magical combination.
You want Kentucky Fried Chicken, you have to visit me.
I guess it's because of the passage of time and that need we all have to share our history and our knowledge that in 2021 I embarked on two big projects. The first, a documentary in which U2, AC/DC, Metallica, and myself, among others, tell our experiences on the road. Those long days traveling crammed in a van, something that may seem an ordeal, but thanks to which Foo Fighters is still together and I am where I am. The documentary is called What Drives Us, and it also includes my first song with my daughter Violet, Nausea. The second big project is my biography, which I have published in 2021 under the name Tales of Life in Music, and where I retrace every step in my professional career and the moments that have made me who I am, a father and a rocker. The year 2022 was marked by the death of our drummer and my dear friend Taylor Hawkins. Although I had always said that without one of its members, Foo Fighters would not exist or release more music, Taylor was much more than a drummer to me. He was a great friend, and I could not think of a better way to pay tribute to him than to keep playing and make a full album in his honor. Thus would emerge, but here we are. During the 10 tracks included in the album, I explore what life is like after the death of a loved one in a superb blend of punk and melodic rock. It is estimated that I am the third richest drummer in the world after Ringo Starr and Phil Collins, and for that I am grateful. But what really makes me happy are two things: the people I love and music. The success for which I prayed so much to heaven has found me, and it is clear that I sold my soul to rock and roll a long time ago.
Thank you very much, Trembles. We love you.